more people coming in, I'm sure. And in the meantime, as usual, I want to thank Capital Federal for their financial support for our program, for all the help they give us. I want to thank you guys for participating. That's what makes it happen. And just remind everybody that we will be recording this in speaker view for the library's YouTube site. And I will send that link out if you want to review things later or go back and check things, or if somebody you know missed it and wants to see it, that will be available within probably early next week. Logan's out, so it won't happen until early next week. But we will have that, so you're aware of it. I think most people are been on before, so you know about the multiple view options and that we're going to do all our questions in chat. So I won't spend my time reiterating all of that stuff. I will take a couple minutes because it is dessert movie. For anybody who wants to chat about their dessert, I will jump ahead and say that I made pecan sandies because it is the driest cookie I could think of making that doesn't taste bad. And also, and I see my wife munching on them right now, so they must be pretty good. So that was my contribution. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves and discuss what dessert they're having tonight, we'll take a minute or so to do that.
I guess I will add that Jack brought me those pecan sandies and I left them on my desk, so I'm going to eat mine tomorrow. It's a belated dessert.
Or anybody who can break into her office tonight.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a glass of water for dessert.
Oh, the
really
healthy dessert. Actually, a very
amazing.
Appropriate dessert.
Yes,
a very
there you
appropriate
go.
dessert.
Well hydrated.
Okay.
That's my
So
chaser.
before we get into the introductions, I was very passionate about finding this and very fortunate that Rex Buchanan agreed to be our guest this evening, because this has been a subject of great interest. Just a quick story. When I was in the shoe business in my previous life, and I was flying down to Brazil in the early 70s, maybe 72. And the gentleman sitting next to me was an American who happened to work for the World Bank. He was going down to Brazil to either investigate a loan that they wanted and to see, you know, if they had what they needed to get it, or he was checking on a loan that they were doing what they were supposed to do. I'm not sure. And we talked about several things. And at the time, that was a time of tremendous oil crisis, as you guys remember. And he turned to me in 1972 and he said, you know, oil's not going to be the big problem. In the coming years, in our lifetime, the issues in this world that's going to cause the biggest crisis and even possibly a world war is food and water. He was older than me, so I'm not sure if it happened in his lifetime, but it sure as heck has happened in ours between the war in Ukraine and the food supply issues in general and what we're going to discuss tonight. So that's why it was important to me. So without further ado, our guest tonight is a past newspaper science writer, also interim director and then director of the Kansas Geological Survey, now director emeritus. He's author, co-author, and editor of several books. He was a 2016 recipient of the Geological Society of America's Public Service Award. So please welcome Rex Buchanan. Thank you, Rex.
Thank you, Jack. I thought if this was dessert in a movie, you would provide people, particularly the speaker, with dessert. And now I'm bitterly disappointed. And
I have to tell you that I normally do, but I didn't know how to get in touch with you. But if you will tell me that, I will send you, because I have extra cookies for the speaker. So they can be on the way to you if you let me know where to drop them off.
don't make empty promises here, because food is pretty much my life, and this
No,
is
no.
not a laughing matter. This is serious business for me. Well, I appreciate the chance to do this, and my understanding is that at least some of the folks have watched the documentary that we talked about, Jack, the one that was set in Texas. I think it's called Written on the Water. And I just went back and rewatched it. That's, I think, a documentary from 2015. I just went back and rewatched it this afternoon, because, and I think the thing holds up pretty well, and it captures a lot of the information about water in Texas, and particularly the Texas Panhandle. What I will do then tonight is build on that a little bit and focus almost entirely on Kansas. If you have some questions about what you saw in that documentary, I'd be glad to try to answer them, but keep in mind my expertise mostly stops at the state line. So with that, I'm going to share my screen here and bring up. Did that work, Jack? Was that a yes? Okay, I think we're good. This is mostly a presentation I've given in the past, and what I'm
That's a
going to.
yes. I'm sorry.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to skip over some slides here at the beginning, but I do want to start with a quick story. This is a few years ago. I did a study with another guy looking at springs in Kansas, and one fall, we were looking at a spring location down in Kiowa County, down there on the Oklahoma border, or close to the Oklahoma border. We were out one October afternoon sampling a spring, and it was hot. It was one of those mid-October days. It was really warm, but overnight, cold front came through. Temperature dropped 40 or 50 degrees. The wind was blowing from the north. It was spitting rain when we went back out the next morning. And when we went back out, all the trees in the location we went to were covered by monarch butterflies that had sort of been caught by the cold front that come through. And they were sitting there sort of waiting to warm up to continue the migration. These were cedar trees that were so covered with butterflies that they looked like those pictures that you see from like National Geographic from down in Mexico where they winter. And they were there because of the vegetation, and the vegetation there was there because of the water. And I think an awful lot of things that we talk about in Kansas, in particular, come back to water. And a lot of this talk is really related to human activities and plant activities related to water. But I'm going to skip past sort of the historical view and go directly to what I think is more germane to what Jack asked me to do. And I'm going to start with this map because to me, I could spend the next 45 minutes talking about this map. It captures really two things that are important. The dotted lines, and on my computer they're yellow, that range from 20 down to 40 are lines of average annual precipitation. And as most of you, I'm sure, know, Kansas is much drier out in the west than it is in the east. It goes from actually 15 inches of precip a year in eastern Kansas or western Kansas to more than 40 in southeastern Kansas. But you also have to keep in mind that average is not always, it may be an accurate, but sometimes a meaningless number when it comes to Kansas. I grew up in Kansas, and I grew up right in the middle of the state in Rice County on a farm. And when I came to graduate school, one of the things I took a look at was a paper studying the 1950s drought. And one of the things I found in Rice County was that average annual precip where I grew up, right in the middle of the state, is 24, 25 inches a year. But when you look at annual totals, what you found was we virtually never got 24 or 25 inches a year. We were almost always way over or way under. For example, right now, they are way under out there. It's really dry. So average is an important number, but you have to understand that it may not mean a lot in any given time period. Okay, so that's average annual precipitation. The other thing on this map is groundwater availability. Groundwater is just the water that's found underneath the Earth's surface, usually in rock formations. The areas in western Kansas on my computer, they're blue, are areas that, on average, if you drilled a well, you could expect to get more than 500 gallons of water per minute from that well. The green is 100 gallons. or less, and then it gets even into smaller amounts. So in effect, the lesson you can draw is Western Kansas is rich when it comes to groundwater. And we'll talk about that groundwater source in just a minute. Eastern Kansas is much poorer when it comes to groundwater. The opposite pertains when it comes to surface water, and surface water is lakes and rivers and streams. A lot of that really common in eastern Kansas, but rare in western Kansas. So out west, not much surface water, but a lot of groundwater. Back here, a lot of surface water, not much groundwater. In effect, Kansas is really two states rather than one when it comes to water. It's just a state that's sort of spliced together with characteristics of both the eastern U.S. and the western U.S. All right, so those are important concepts that I'll refer to as we go along. This is just a map that shows how much people use groundwater versus surface water in each county of the state. Just the guy that made it for me refers to it as a Pac-Man map because it kind of looks like that little icon. You can see it reflects much of what I just showed you. Out west, people are almost entirely reliant on groundwater. In eastern Kansas, highly reliant on surface water. Okay? Now, I'm going to talk about two issues tonight. I'm going to pass over the first one pretty fast, but it is an important one, and it's kind of a hobby horse of mine, and so I don't want to let an opportunity go by without talking about it, and that is lack of stream flow in the state. This is a map that shows perennial streams in 1961 versus 1994. Perennial streams are those streams that flow all the time. And you can see if you compare those that there are a number of segments of rivers that are present in 1961 that are not present in 1994. The most notable one is the Arkansas River down from roughly Garden City to Great Bend, which was dry in 1994 and by and large has been dry since 1985. Here's an updated version of this same map. The dotted lines are where the river once flowed but no longer flows. And you can see it's not just the Arkansas River, but it's a number of these tributaries in western Kansas. A lot of the reason for that reduced stream flow is irrigation. When irrigation wells are drilled along the side of a river, in effect, in the alluvium or the soils that neighbor a major river, they are in effect taking water out of the river, even though they're not directly in the stream flow. That tends to dry the rivers up. And that's why, for example, the Arkansas River, one of the biggest rivers in the state, is largely dry from Garden City to Great Bend. It's not because of anything Colorado has done. It's Kansas irrigation. And I've always said that what troubles me about the Ark in particular is it's one of the major rivers in the state. And yet whenever anybody sees water in it, they're surprised. Well, I think it's a kind of a sad statement on us as a people that you're surprised when you see water in one of the major rivers in the state. And that has consequences not just for the Arkansas. One thing that's been one topic that's been in the news related to this quite a bit lately is lack of stream flow into Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, also in central Kansas, real close to where I grew up. Quivira is where a lot of whooping cranes stop on their migration. It doesn't get the stream flow into it that it has a water right for. As a result, a lot of times it is dried up and doesn't have the amount of water that it should have. The reason for that is this map here. This is a map of Rattlesnake Creek, which flows into Quivira Wildlife Refuge. All those dots are water rights that withdraw water from along the edge of the river, in effect, drying up the river, thus decreasing stream flow into Quivira, affecting the waterfowl that migrate through. So it's an issue not just of just mild interest. It's an issue of importance to wildlife in the state. And this particular location is the subject of a lawsuit related to water rights at Quivira. Now, I think really what you wanted me to talk about tonight, Jack, is what was the topic of the movie, which was the Ogallala Aquifer. But let's get some terminology straight. The Ogallala is part of what's called the High Plains Aquifer, okay? Now, I'll talk about the Ogallala tonight, but just so you know, the The aquifer that's shown in this figure that underlies all or parts of 8 states is called the High Plains Aquifer. A subset of that aquifer is the Ogallala. So again, the Ogallala is mostly sand and gravel that's filled up with water over time. In the documentary you saw, they occasionally referred to that as a sandstone aquifer, and I don't think I would. I would call it mostly a sand and gravel aquifer. It's got water in the pore spaces of the sand and gravel. All right. Well, let's go to Kansas. Here's the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. And by the way, just to back up, you can see that there is a fair amount of High Plains Aquifer in Texas, out in West Texas and up in North Texas, which was the subject of that documentary. So here's Kansas. Here's the Ogallala portion of Kansas, roughly the western third. Okay. So the Ogallala is a subset of the High Plains Aquifer. All right. There are 2 other components in Kansas. This one's called the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer, and then the Equus Beds Aquifer in the Wichita area supplies a lot of the water for the city of Wichita. Altogether, they make up the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. So that's the Ogallala. Now, one thing that's really important to remember about the Ogallala as I talk about this is it's highly heterogeneous. That is, it's highly variable from place to place. It's not a big, giant bathtub under the ground, okay? A lot of times when you hear people talk about aquifers, they talk about underground reservoirs. And there was even almost a reference in that documentary to that. And that's really misleading. They're not underground lakes. They're not underground reservoirs. You can't drill a hole in the ground and send a scuba diver down to paddle around in the Ogallala. It's more like a sponge made out of rock, sand and gravel, okay? So it varies from place to place. And even on this map, you can see some parts of western Kansas, there is no Ogallala at all in west central Kansas. Other places, there's a lot. It's very thick. So it's highly variable, okay? So beginning in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people figured out there was a lot of water in the Ogallala that they could pump water out, use high-capacity pumps, and put it on fields. And this is what they did back in the old days. This is an aerial view of a field that used what they call flood irrigation. Along one end of the field, the left-hand end of this field, there'd be a pipe with holes in it. They'd pump water through those holes. It would go out into furrows on the ground, and that's what those darker spots are, and water the plants. Okay. The problem with that kind of irrigation is several-fold. One is it requires relatively level ground, but not quite flat. It needs to drain one direction so the water will actually flow, or else it'll pond up. It also puts a lot more water on this end of the field than on the right-hand side of the field. Okay. It's got drawbacks. It's what people used until really the 1950s and 60s when they began to adopt center pivot irrigation system. And I know you've all seen these when you've driven across western Kansas. Basically big lawn sprinklers on wheels. They go out in a circular fashion. They water the ground. Their advantage is they spread the water out equally, so all the crops get the same dose of water. They can also go over hills. So now you can water tracts of ground you wouldn't be able to water with just flood irrigation. They change it. It's a game changer. Now you can grow all sorts of crops that you couldn't really grow before. The primary one is corn. This is what one of those center pivot systems looks like from the air. And I always enjoy flying over western Kansas on commercial flights because a lot of times people don't know what these are. And it's always impressive to me what people will believe in terms of stories about what these are. You got to get your entertainment wherever you can. So with the advent of large-scale irrigation, people can now grow crops they couldn't grow before, in particular corn. With that, they could then create really big feedlots to feed that corn to cattle that didn't used to exist. Once you have those feedlots, then you have big packing plants. And this is a picture from the era of what was at the time of construction the world's largest packing plant. It's at Holcomb, just west of Garden City. The kill rate there is 5,500 head of cattle a day, which I grew up on a farm. We had a feedlot. Trust me, 5,500 head of cattle a day is a lot. They bring them in, they put them in this sort of curved corral. They go up this little white chute up into the packing plant, and then they come out the other side in pieces in boxes. Really, that water has allowed a revolution in the landscape of western Kansas, because without that water, you can't grow corn. Without the corn, you don't have cattle. Without the cattle, you don't have these packing plants. And with the packing plants come all sorts of people who work in the packing plants, who really changed the culture of western Kansas. But it all goes back to water. Okay, I'm going to change sort of depictions on the map for you for just a little bit here. This is not a map of the entire state. It's about a map of about the western half of Kansas to give you some help. On the right-hand side is Sedgwick County, where Wichita is. All right, everybody, I hope you find that. Far southwestern Kansas, Morton County. Northwestern Kansas, Cheyenne County. All right, western half of Kansas by county. This is the amount of aquifer that was saturated with water prior to the advent of large-scale irrigation. And again, remember what I said about the Ogallala is highly variable. You can see in some places it's more than 300 feet of saturated thickness, particularly in southwestern Kansas, down here, and Garden City would be about here, to much less up in, say, northwestern Kansas. Again, highly variable from place to place, but in some places very extensive. Okay. So how do we know how much water is in there? Well, every year we go out and measure these wells, really beginning in the 50s and 60s. Prior to that time, and there was even reference in the documentary to this, there was a time in the 20s and 30s when people thought that the Ogallala was infinite. That is, you couldn't possibly pump it dry. You couldn't pump all that water out of there. Sort of the way we looked at oil at one time. Well, beginning in really the 1940s and 50s, we come to the realization that it is finite. We can lower water levels. And so the state began a program of going out to measure water levels throughout the state to get a sense of what those trends were doing. So every January, a group of people from the Geological Survey, where I worked, along with the Division of Water Resources, which regulates water in the state, we go out and measure water levels in about 1,400 wells across western and central Kansas, and that's what each of those dots is in the map in the upper left-hand corner. We use a steel tape, we drop it. Most of these irrigation wells, we drop it down holes at the base of that well. We use some fairly simple math and figure out how deep the water is to see how much it's declined from year to year. And I put this in here because there may be some people on here who know me. And those people who know me have probably never actually seen me do anything because I don't do much. And this is actually a picture of me working. It's a very rare photograph. I tell people this is like wildlife photography. You know, they talk about how like the photographer had to lie and wait for days to watch the cheetah eat the gazelle or something like that, you know. That's what it's like with me. You follow me around for weeks and I won't do anything, but then I might spring into action. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm measuring a well because I go out with this group. We've done this every year since 1995. Go out and measure wells for a week in January. And actually, I enjoy it when the weather is nice. And the day that this photo was taken, the weather was nice. This was in Morton County, far southwestern Kansas. It was actually 85 degrees in early January. So it was in all honesty, this is my idea of a good time, sadly enough. So we go out every January because the wells are not pumping. You can't measure wells while they're pumping. The water tables had a little time to stabilize. We try to go out every year. We leave January 2nd, just like clockwork. And we're out there for about a week measuring these things. And it's maybe a little hard to see. Don't worry too much about it. But I want to put this in there because this is last year's results. And the kind of the darker the color, the more orangey colors, the bigger the declines. This is 1 year worth of declines. And you can see in some places in southwestern Kansas, we get 5 to 10 feet of decline. It's not common, but we get it. And you can see that in southwestern Kansas and up in sort of west central Kansas. Other places maybe 1 to 2 feet. Now, it's really dry the year before. And when it's dry, people pump more and you get bigger declines. Okay, so last year was a tough year in terms of groundwater declines, but keep these numbers in mind. This is 1 year's worth of decline in water level, all right? maybe a more meaningful way to look at this is over time. So here is kind of an animation that will show absolute decline. Total number of feet changes from 1996 up to however long this animation runs. I can't remember. I think it goes through 17, but it might go even a little bit longer. And I'll let it run a couple times so you can see it. Yeah. Okay. And what you see is kind of bullseyes blow up where you see really large declines over time. And again, this is just a map of western Kansas, western and central Kansas, and you see those really big declines, some cases more than 50 or 60 feet over that number of years just in southwestern Kansas. Again, highly variable from place to place to place. All right. Well, that's one way of looking at this, but I'm not sure it's the best way, because keep in mind, that was absolute. That was total feet of decline. But as I said earlier, there's a lot more water in some places than other places. A more meaningful way to look at this number is percent decline, okay? And I noticed in the documentary, they would make reference to both absolute feet declines and percent declines. Percent declines are really more meaningful. You know, if something has declined 100 feet, but that's only used up 25% of the aquifer, maybe it's not that big a deal. But if you only had 150 feet to start with and you take 100 feet out, then it is a big deal. And this map shows percent decline from pre-development, beginning of irrigation, up to 2020. Now you see some very different things show up. West Central Kansas, the hotter colors are the greater percentages, more than 60% declines in West Central Kansas and parts of southwestern Kansas. All right. So this map, I think, does a much better job of depicting the hot spots, the places you need to worry about. All right. Another question that comes up from time to time is recharge, how much water flows back naturally into the aquifer. This is a rough map that estimates it. I'm not sure it's completely accurate, but it's kind of the best we had at the time I put these slides together. You can see it ranges from 3 or 4 inches in eastern Kansas or central Kansas to less than an inch out in western Kansas. This is the water that naturally goes back into the ground via precipitation. The point of this is recharge, in effect, is negligible. When you're taking water out at the rate of, well, in some places just last year, the declines were 4 or 5 feet. You're taking it out, say, 48 inches in a given year, and you're replacing it a half an inch a year. In effect, it's a non-renewable resource. People talk about water as a renewable resource, and in most contexts it is, not in this one, okay? It's really a finite resource that is not renewable, and that's sort of what this is showing. I want to touch on this real quickly because this is a case where Kansas is very different from Texas. In that documentary, they talked about the rule of capture, which I think is a terrible law, and Kansas does not have that. In Kansas, the first statute that's important here is that all the water within the state of Kansas is dedicated to the use of the people of the state of Kansas. In effect, that means it belongs to everybody, all right? In Texas, it's the rule of capture. Whoever can pump it out wins. And that leads to some of the behaviors you saw in Texas that are really not in anybody's best interest, except maybe for the person that's capturing the water. Also in Kansas, water law is based on, you have to have a right to pump a large amount of water. In Kansas, water law is based on the idea of first in time, first in right. The person with the oldest water right wins. So if you've got an old water right and I've got a newer water right, and I pump a well and I interfere with your ability to pump your water, you can shut me down, okay? First in time, first in right. Couple of other things. The water rights are administered by the Division of Water Resources in the state of Kansas. Those are the people that go out and help us measure those water levels that I mentioned. And then finally, Kansas has groundwater management districts. Texas has somewhat similar districts they talk about in that documentary. Kansas has 5 groundwater management districts that are shown on this map in various colors. 3 of them cover the Ogallala. They were created in the 70s, really, again, as an instrument of local control. You heard reference to a lot of local control in that documentary. That basically people said, it's the folks that live out here that know best how we should use this resource. And I think it would be safe to say that that is an overwhelming philosophy from the folks that live in Western Kansas. In my experience, they don't like government at all, The government they like least is the federal government. Then the state government is the one they like next least, and they prefer local government. And that's what these were created were as units of basically local government to deal with this issue. The problem with it is that it's hard for local government to shut down local people. And the manager of this district up in northwestern Kansas once expressed it to me as saying, how do you shut down somebody you have to go drink coffee with every day of the week? So really, they've looked to the state to administer water rights, to adjudicate water rights, and that's sort of where we stand. There isn't much of that that's gone on, but the Quivira lawsuit is over water rights because Quivira has a senior water right to a lot of those dots on the map that I showed you as points of diversion. So that's one of the way Kansas has tried to deal with this issue. And by the way, it's had some luck with these yellow areas, which are called local enhanced management areas, where people have voluntarily gotten together to slow down pumping by about 20%. Hey, and one last thing I want to mention related to that documentary. They talked a lot about conservation, and conservation is great. You ought to use water as efficiently as you can, no question about it. But don't think that conservation equals using less water. All right? And I know that may sound like a nonsensical sentence, but it's not. Just because you conserve water doesn't mean you don't use it someplace else. And if you have a water right and you save some of your water in one place, the temptation to use that water on another field is really great. So conservation doesn't equate with less water use. That's one of the reasons these yellow areas called LEMAs are so important, because they have said they will cut back water use by 20%. And by and large, they've been success stories. If they are careful, they can generally make about the same amount of money with what they grow as they could if they pumped 100% of their water right. So that's kind of the story on the Ogallala and stream flow. I want to finish with one last story and then maybe take questions or comments or whatever. And I think, Jack, people can start typing them in if they want to do that. I want to finish with this story. This is Point of Rocks out in Morton County, far southwestern Kansas. It's on the Cimarron National Grasslands, which to my mind are one of the most spectacular places in the state, far southwestern Kansas, just north of Elkhart. This is actually the Ogallala Formation. That rock that crops out there is part of the Ogallala Formation. This is kind of an overlook on a Point of Rocks. And we typically, when I was at the survey, would do field trips for legislators. Every summer we would take them out to look at issues on the ground, particularly natural resource related legislators. And one year we went to this location, and it was May when we were doing the field work to go out there. And it happened that it had rained a lot in that May. And this is Point of Rocks looking from down below. That's the Ogallala Formation again. So it rained a lot the May we were out there. And this is a flower whose name I struggle with. I think the scientific term is Gaillardia. And I assume, hopefully some of you are nodding your head yes. It's got various unscientific names. I get it mixed up with Giardia. I think Giardia is the bad thing that you don't want in your stomach, and Gaillardia is good. But I get them confused. Anyway, this particular year, it had rained, and this stuff was blooming everywhere. And the view from on top of Point of Rocks was nothing but an orange haze from the blooming of this flower. Now, I grew up in Kansas, and like a lot of kids, I had read I think it was Little House on the Prairie, where Laura Ingalls Wilder talks about, hey, I got in a book reference at a library talk. Look at me. So, where was I? So anyway, she wrote about the prairies being like a carpet of wildflowers. And I remember reading that and thinking, well, I grew up on a farm. We have pastures. I don't see that, and I will never see that. It's not like that. But on this day, when we were at Point of Rocks in Morton County, I did see it. And the reason I saw it was because it had rained and it was water. Because everything, one way or another in this state, comes back to water at one point or another. So with that, I thanks for the chance to do this. I usually mention my grandmother was the town librarian where I grew up, and reading in my family was a almost sacrosanct, I would say. So libraries to me are really, really important. And I salute the job you all have done in Lawrence Public Library, because I think it's one of the great institutions in this town and is really just a wonderful place. And my hat's off to what you've done there. So with that, Jack, I'll see.
Okay, if
Let
you want to
me.
stop the share so we can see you.
I'll try. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Okay, we're
Now.
good. We have a few questions already. But before that, I will say I do have your address now, so cookies will be there by tomorrow morning. So
Okay.
I can get out of being in trouble.
Don't,
More importantly, the
wait a
first
second.
question, the first question is a big one. How far into the future are the aquifers sustainable to?
First of all, just to go back, don't toy with me on this cookie thing. And by the way, we also have a like a doorbell cam. So if you come up there and don't leave cookies, we will know. I don't know where you live, but I'll figure it out. Okay, a lot of times in this talk, I include a slide that I didn't include tonight in interest of time that answers that question. Because the question basically is, how long will the water last out there? Okay. Again, the answer, and this is the classic academic answer, is it depends. And what it depends is where you are, because again, that aquifer is highly variable. So there are places, I would say, in effect, where the future has already arrived. They're done. I used to give this talk and say, you're never going to have to worry about domestic water wells. That is, a water well for a house. Never going to have to worry about that. There's always going to be enough water for that. It's large-scale irrigation that's going to have trouble. Well, things have gotten bad enough that there are parts of west central Kansas that even domestic wells are problematic. So I would say in parts of west central Kansas, there are places where, in effect, the game is over. There are other places around the fringes of the aquifer or in other parts where it's, I think, almost sustainable. Certainly off into the long future, 40, 50, 60 years. A lot of the parts of the aquifer, it's more like 20 to 30 years. And it just depends on where you are, how thick the water level is. It also depends on a lot of things that we don't know the answer to, one of which is how much is it going to rain? Because in years when it's dry, like we're in now, people pump a lot more. That lowers the water level faster. If you can tell me how much it's going to rain, what energy prices are going to be, because that affects how much people pump, and what the price of corn is going to be, because that affects how much people pump. If you can tell me those three things, then we can tell you how long the aquifer is going to last. The problem is you can't tell me those three things, so we don't know. All we can do is project. But again, and the survey has a website devoted to the Ogallala, and you can go out and see some of those projected maps that are on there and get a sense if there's some particular area that you're interested in.
Okay. The next question is a little more specific. Quivira has had some problems maintaining their pools due to agricultural usage on the Rattlesnake Creek. How is the Cheyenne Bottoms managing? Does it get enough water?
Yeah, and Cheyenne Bottoms is a somewhat similar situation to Quivira. It's north of Quivira. The depression, it's not a salt marsh the way Quivira is, but both of them were historically places for waterfowl to stop and rest on their migration. In fact, I would say Cheyenne Bottoms even bigger than Quivira. And yeah, the drying up of Quivira has been largely related to irrigation along Rattlesnake Creek. Cheyenne Bottoms and Quivira is a federal wildlife refuge. Cheyenne Bottoms state wildlife refuge. And as it began to dry up a lot in the 80s, there was a real effort to work with the locals out there to cut back on pumping, to come up with sort of an equitable solution to get water in Cheyenne Bottoms. So Cheyenne Bottoms, for the most part, has gotten the water it's supposed to get. It's been more stable. But even years like last year, when it is as dry as it was last year, Cheyenne Bottoms pretty much completely dried up. Now, historically, Cheyenne Bottoms would dry up 1 year out of 3. So you might say, well, what's the big deal? If it always dried up 1 year out of 3, what's the big deal if it dries up now? Well, the big deal is once people come along and they start farming, they farm up an awful lot of those potholes and playas and places that held water. that the birds could go to when Cheyenne Bottoms was dry. Well, now those are not available. So you have made them highly dependent on a few locations. When those go away, they really have trouble. So that's kind of the answer there.
Okay. Next question. Is Nebraska similar to Kansas as far as the aquifers and shortages of water?
You know, somebody one time asked me what the difference was between the sand hills of Nebraska and the sand hills that you see in Kansas. And I said, well, the sand hills in Nebraska are in Nebraska and the sand hills in Kansas are in Kansas. I thought it was kind of a funny answer, but they didn't. If you go back to, if you remember the map that showed the Ogallala, there's much more of it in Nebraska than there is in Kansas. A lot of more of Nebraska is underlain by the Ogallala, and it's much thicker. The upshot is that Nebraska has a lot more water than Kansas does, and the other upshot of that is they tend not to worry about regulation the way that Kansas has, because in a lot of respects they don't need to. So Kansas, I would say Kansas and Nebraska very different, and a lot of that difference is to Nebraska's advantage. But sooner or later, you're saying this, you know, again, it's still a finite resource. Sooner or later, you're going to face the same issues. Yeah.
And also, Kay also asked, will some of the small towns in western Kansas have to bring in water for their residents? Where would they be able to get the water if the aquifers are dry?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's very germane. There have been steps. One of those LEMAs that I showed you, the voluntary areas, was up in northwestern Kansas, and you've seen some of that in west central Kansas. But the solution proposed by southwestern Kansas, which is really the name of the game when it comes to water, because that's where the Ogallala is thickest in Kansas, their solution is an aqueduct. And what they want to do is take water from northeastern Kansas, basically near the Missouri River, and pipe it or build an aqueduct to southwestern Kansas. There are a lot of issues related to that. One is it's a long ways uphill, so it's going to have to take a lot of energy. There are also people downstream who are not thrilled with that idea. I would guess the economic burdens, the legal burdens, and the environmental burdens are sufficient to make that very difficult to do. But that has been their answer to the question. I don't think it's a particularly realistic one, but that's what they've chosen. That's what they've chosen to do. Now, the question, I guess, was about small towns. And there is also the possibility that if the problem got severe enough, some of those towns might band together to try to move water. But for the most part, those small towns have been fairly proactive in making sure they've got water rights. There are a few that have had issues, but by and large, they have been proactive in acquiring water rights. And mostly cities can afford to go out and pay for water rights that maybe farmers couldn't. I always tell people, okay, Jack, let me ask you, what's your water bill every month? Do you know?
Mine?
Yeah.
Because it's mixed in with the trash and everything like that, I'd have to go look at the bill to figure it out.
So, just give me your total. What's your guess?
My total bill for a small lot and house, we're at probably average $150 a month.
Okay, and so let's say they doubled the price of water in Lawrence and put it up to $250 a month. What would you do?
I would have to give up something else.
Really?
I don't know. Maybe I don't know that we would move. I don't know.
My guess is you would pay your water bill.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I mean, I would have to give up something else to pay the water
exactly.
bill. Yeah.
And cities have that kind of clout because people are going to pay their water bills. They're not going to go without water. And that gives cities clout that maybe irrigators don't have. And so a lot of times it has they have sort of the wherewithal to do things that people don't do. Okay. I can see, yeah, okay. Kathleen asked this question about different crops.
Okay.
And that's a really good question too, because corn is very water thirsty. It takes 24 inches of water a year. You see more and more growing of where I was a kid, we called milo. It's grain sorghum, much smaller growing plant. you can grow it on much less water than you can corn. And the problem is it's not as lucrative. Okay. They grow, and they made that point in that documentary. They're not, I mean, these guys are not stupid. In fact, they're pretty smart. They grow what makes the most money. Corn makes the most money, they grow corn. If Milo made as much money, they'd grow Milo. Because of lack of water, you are seeing more and more Milo out there. And I've heard some pretty big numbers along those lines. You also see more cotton in southwestern Kansas, particularly the last few years. I don't think you can do cotton quite as far north. You can't do it way up far north in Kansas, but you can do it in southwestern Kansas. Cotton doesn't take as much water. So there is that movement. And when people ask me to sort of envision the future, I always say, well, I think you're not going to see the place dry up and blow away, but what you are going to see is a lot of crops you don't see today. You see more Milo, more corn, more dryland wheat, less corn, okay? And they alluded to some of that in the movie. One other point related to the movie I do want to go back to is also a fair amount of that corn goes into making ethanol. And that one's one that I will tell you just on a personal basis, I find sort of perplexing. And when people ask me what I think about depletion of the Ogallala, I always say, well, if you're going to quit using water out there, you better have a good reason, because there are a lot of people whose livelihood depends on that, which that movie depicted very well. What I think is in 100 years from now, your great-great-grandchildren, or whatever, how many greats you want to add on there, are going to look back at us and look at this generation, and they're going to say, what were you thinking? You pumped all that water out of the ground to grow $5 a bushel corn, a quarter of which went to make ethanol. And we can't live out there now because there's no water. Now, that's what I think, but you can't shut somebody's water right off legally based on my depiction of 100 years from now. So I don't know if that was related to the question, but I threw it in there anyway. Yeah, playas. Playas are big, kind of depressions. You don't see them around here. You see them out in western Kansas. They hold water when you get a lot of rain. They'll hold water sometimes for long periods of time. The jury's kind of out on how much they recharge the aquifer. You would think that they would, okay? You would think that water would infiltrate. But like a lot related to science, just because you might think something doesn't mean it's true. And it really needs to be studied. And we're just now looking at it in Kansas in a detailed way. Because a lot of times those playas have a base that it may be very rich in clay, which retards the movement of that water into the subsurface. So the answer is we don't know. But I would say, I think that anybody that would say that we are going to solve this problem by importing water or recharging water through playas has another think coming. Okay. I mean, that might help. Don't get me wrong, but we're taking it out at rates so far beyond that's hardly a sustainable solution. I see the next one about, are they finding out they can actually use less water on crops? And they are being much more efficient. Like I said up there in that Lima, they use 20% less water. And by and large, they're finding that they can do okay economically doing that. And they are much more careful today. Back in the old days, they used to flip the switch, starting those center pivot systems. They'd flip the switch in April and they'd shut it off in August. And they never shut them down. Kind of the way they talked about in that movie they talked about 110 days of irrigation. Well, nowadays they're much more careful about that. And if it's wet and they don't need to irrigate, they don't, because it's expensive and there's less water. They've gotten much, much better about watering than they used to be. In fact, one of the people that showed up in that movie was Lon Fromm from Colby. I don't know if you remember him. He had kind of a nice living room, and he talked about little towns going away. And then the next person in the movie was kind of critical of Lon. Well, Lon's a pretty good friend of mine. The guy that was critical of him said something like, anybody that would say that doesn't live in a small town. Well, I don't know how you define small town, but I think that, Colby's less than 5,000 people population. That's a small town in my book. I think Lon knows exactly what he's talking about. That comment irritated me a little bit. And I have no idea why. I just threw that in there.
The other question's about corn.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
And Yeah, and by the way, Lon farms 45,000 acres. He's a big, serious, big time farmer. You go out to visit Lon's farm, and he knows exactly what the soil conditions are in every one of those fields. He knows exactly how much water he's putting on. It is a high tech operation beyond anything you've ever seen. So these folks, and Lon's a fairly extreme case, but these people are careful nowadays. Yeah, that last question is a political question. And and maybe I'll end with this, Jack, because I got this question here in Lawrence. I gave this talk one night at the Lawrence Audubon Club and a society, and somebody in the audience got up and said, "Doesn't it bother farmers that on the one hand they criticize the federal government, on the other hand they take subsidies from the federal government?" And by the way, they don't get direct subsidies so much anymore as they get crop insurance, but it kind of works out to be the same thing. So anyway, they asked this question: doesn't that contradiction bother them? And I was kind of proud of myself. I said, well, I believe it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who said, "A foolish inconsistency is the hobgoblin of small minds." Uh, thank you for for laughing, Jack. I hate it when I can't hear the audience. Of course, there's probably nobody laughing anyway. But the other
I see
quote
the
like that
smile.
is Jeff Goldblum in the movie The Big Chill. Some of you remember Jeff Goldblum says, "I don't remember. I don't know if anybody that can get through the entire day without a good rationalization." You want to be critical for farmers for taking it with one hand and criticizing with the other. They're no different than anybody else. Come on. I mean, they're doing what the system is telling them to do. You can't criticize them for that. Lon uses a lot of water, and when I talk to him about it, all he says is, "Hey, I'm playing by the rules. You guys set the rules. You set the rules, I'll obey them." Okay. I would say that there's a farm bill getting worked right now, and it will have the same kind of insurance programs that we have right now. Uh, if you want to talk about subsidies for ethanol, change the Iowa primary from being the first in the country to one of the later ones, and maybe ethanol goes away. It's all political, and right now, I would say that you get what you pay for. That's another thing. Somebody in that movie said, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. What I always say is there's one rule related to water, and that is it flows to money. And it doesn't necessarily flow downhill; it flows to money. And I think that movie brought that out, and maybe some of the things that I talk about have too.
I I have one quick question, and I'm trying to remember because this happened 6 or 8 years ago, but some time ago Georgia was in a terrible drought. I think it was like maybe 8 years ago. And I read a story, and I don't remember all the details, about a small town, and they were like running out of water, and they built a wetland. They created a wetland, and it created, and I'm not a biologist, so I don't, but it created through its own wetlandness a bunch of water. And they were able to pump that water and take care of the water need in their town and export water to other towns. I don't understand that, but is that a possible concept?
Oh, it's more than a concept. It gets used in
Okay.
places. You have to have that water to begin with, but very often people are using wastewater, which they would normally, like in Lawrence, discharge after treatment into a stream. But if you put it into wetlands and then use it to recharge an aquifer, then in effect you're capturing water that might have gone moved away from you. And
That's
one
what
of
I
the
believe they were doing. It was part
right,
of their internal water
wastewater
system.
treatment. And out in Dodge City, they take wastewater from one of the packing plants and pump it to a field and use it for irrigation water. One of the points that movie made really well is, in effect, they are exporting water out of there, whether they're exporting it in the form of beef or corn, or right now there are a lot of dairies out there. They're exporting in terms of milk and cheese. And in Garden City, they created a milk dehydration plant so they could capture the water out of the milk, keep the water, use it the ways you're talking about, Jack, and then just export the dry milk powder as a way to avoid exporting water as part of this process. So, yeah, there are those concepts will work, but there's also a scale issue here. Okay, that might work
Yeah.
for a small town. It's not going to work for New York City. It might work for a few fields south of Dodge City. It's not going to solve the Ogallala issue. So, yeah, it is a concept. It works. I see. Yeah, that Running Out book is by Lucas Brashear, who's from Oklahoma State. You know, one thing's, yeah, and that is a fairly recent book that talks about it. He grew up south of Ulysses in southwestern Kansas and talks about some of the issues, particularly related to groundwater management districts and their struggle to regulate water in Kansas. Yeah.
Yeah. Kathleen just posted the link for that one. So
Yeah.
if you want to check
Click.
it out, you can check it out right now. She's really good at that.
Yeah,
Get on the
everybody
whole
can.
list.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd say you have now. Yeah, you also can buy books, and as an author,
No.
as much as I like libraries, occasionally I do have a beef with them when it comes to my books. It's one thing to you want to borrow Lucas's book, Be My Guest. You look at a Buchanan book. The Raven is a great bookstore. So,
And it is that. And it is that. Okay.
Yeah.
Any more quick questions? If not, we're going to have to start closing this out, I think. Don't see anything else being typed. I will throw out one last thing, and that was, if I remember correctly, from my reading in history, there was, I believe, a woman in the Eisenhower administration while he was building all the roads, whose idea was to build a pipeline in an equal network all across the United States. Her thought was, where there's a drought in one part and a flood in another, you could move that water. Obviously, it was too expensive and it didn't get done. But boy, what a difference that might have made if she had gotten that through Congress. And it was a
maybe.
point that out.
Yeah, maybe yes and maybe no. Keep in mind that when you take water from one spot and you move it to another spot, that's fine as long as you're moving excess water.
Yeah.
It only works if you've got too much water. And if you don't have too much water, it doesn't work. And that's so. Yeah, I'm not sure it would have. I'm not sure it would have been the solution. Maybe in some short-term places. Yeah.
Jack?
Yeah. Yes. Please go ahead, Ken.
Rex, can you have some books that you've written? Can you give, if you can give us titles or?
Is your name Kay?
Yes.
And so where do I send the check to you afterwards for this little plug here? Boy, I did a book with Jim McCauley called Roadside Kansas, kind of a non-technical guide to geology. That one probably, I hope, at the library and should be at bookstores. I did another one called Kansas Geology. And then a few years ago, just 3 or 4 years ago, I did one with Burke Griggs from here in town and another guy, Josh Swati, called Petroglyphs of the Kansas Smoky Hills. That one's about Native American rock carvings out in central Kansas where I grew up.
That's
And
got
those
illustrations
features.
in it too, pictures.
What's that? Yeah, that one's kind of,
illustrations in it.
yeah, that one's kind of a coffee table book. Yeah, Burke is the photographer. And that one, almost all of those locations that we depicted in that book are related to water. So there is a strong connection here. And I love that book. And that like I said, I grew up and walked around those features, and I'm really proud of that book. It's been successful, if you haven't seen it or you don't have a copy, I would encourage you there. I always tell people, okay, we're not that far from Halloween, right? And candy's not good for kids, right? It's hard on their teeth. It's not good for them. Think of how pleased those little kids would be if they walked up and did trick or treating, and instead of candy, the nice thunk of a book into that bag. Wouldn't that be pleasing? So think of that as we come into October there. Right?
There you go. The books in the library are all posted. You can get the names from there and also go buy them. So, give fair enough. That's a good source of names as well. And for Halloween, we give out wine to the parents. So I don't know what we're going to do, but
I'm coming to your house.
yeah, please,
You're treating it.
please do. We should have a pretty large party on the lawn. So, all right, we're going to have to kind of close it out. I can't thank Rex Buchanan enough.
Bravo.
It's not often we get somebody here who's famous, and he is. So,
yeah. As
but-
my wife likes to say, it's a really little pond. Okay.
I don't agree, but no, it's great and a tremendous authority. I will give the movie one extra kudos as we were watching it. And my wife did a little bit of looking up the producer, director, writer. The poetry and music in the movie made it really exceptionally good movie, which kept your attention while you were getting the statistics as well. So I thought it was very well done for a book about water and facts and information. Just really well done. But at any rate, we'll have to close it out at that point. So I really appreciate everybody coming. I appreciate the fact that Rex was able to join